This is hardly my first time performing. However, it is my first time at this event.
Yay!
So, and if I'm not stoned to death for telling bad jokes, I might actually come back again. What I was thinking of doing is telling one of my favorite stories. It's one I've learned rather recently. It is a bit long, but hopefully we can suffer through this. I have made it a point to try to study and learn stories from all across the world. And one of the things I've noticed is that no matter where you go, what culture you study, they all have certain things in common. And one of the things they have in common is virtually everyone has at least one story about somebody who tried to cheat death. This is one of those. It comes from the mysterious land of India. It is called the Three Wishes of Savitri. Now, this tale is set at a time before India was one great kingdom. It was instead a group of small, disconnected kingships, sometimes at peace with each other, sometimes not so much. And it was into one of these kingdoms that the Princess Savitri was born. She grew up mostly within the walls of the palace. And when she reached an age to become married, there was this endless line of young men who came there trying to win her hand and thereby establish themselves a prime position at court. But Savitri was very choosy and very stubborn, and one after another she rejected every one of them. At one point her mother sat down with her and said, "Savitri, what is it that you are seeking in a husband?" And she replied, "To be honest, I'm not certain. I am pretty sure that I will know it when I see it. And I'm also fairly certain now that I am not going to find it sitting here in the palace." So she then developed the habit of disguising herself as a commoner and wandering out through the town, meeting people, talking about various things, sometimes even traveling beyond the city walls to travel out to the countryside. And it was on one of these journeys that she spotted this handsome young man who was carrying on his back this great pile of sticks. And curious, she fell into walking beside him and says, "Tell me, where are you going with this great load?" And he said, "Well, this is to cook my food and heat my house. And since I am fond of neither cold food nor a cold house to sleep in, this is a task I must do every week or so." Oh. And she asked him, "Tell me, do you live alone?" And he said, "No, I live with my father, who I must spend much of my time caring for." "Well, your father must be very old then," she said. And he replied, "Well, not at all. In fact, until a recent date, he was the king of his own kingdom. But there were those who plotted against him, and they conspired to have him poisoned. Now, the poison did not kill him, but it did strike him blind. And since a blind man cannot defend himself properly, much less rule a great kingdom, we were forced to flee here." "So," said Savitri, "you are actually a prince then?" And the young man only shrugged as best he could under his great load and said, "Well, I suppose technically that is true, but without a kingdom of my own, now I am simply the Prince of Firewood." And then he said to her, "My name is Kavi, and we have little to offer, but our house is just over the next hill. If you wish, you can join us for dinner." And intrigued, she did so. And that afternoon, she was regaled with simple fare and many stories. And she was quite impressed by the knowledge of this young man and his father and their knowledge of the world. But what impressed her most was this man's kindness and his sense of humor. And by the end of the dinner, she had made the decision, this is the man I would choose as my husband. She then returned to the palace and announced this to her parents, which, as you can imagine, like any parent, they were at once suspicious of this young man that they had never met before. But after some discussion, her father said, "Very well, we shall consult the oracles, and if the signs look proper, it shall be so." And this was done. But the next morning, when the oracles came back into the throne room, their expression was not a favorable one. And the chief oracle bowed to the king and said, "Your Majesty, I bring good news, but also bad. The good news is, yes, this man is the true prince, as he claims. But the bad news is, the signs show us that this man has a defect within his body, something that he himself is not even aware of. And thus it is that all of the omens say that he will be dead within a year. And so we would advise strongly against this marriage." At this point, Savitri turned to her parents and said, "I do not accept this pronouncement. You know as well as I that these oracles are wrong as often as they are right. I have chosen this man to be my husband, and I will have him as such." Well, the argument went on, and I did mention stubborn, did I not? Yes, she got her way, and they were truly married. Now, after the marriage ceremony, she announced, and properly so, that at least for a while she would be living with her husband and his father, as appropriate for a new bride. This served her well because she much preferred the solitude and peace of the forest than to the constant activity and intrigues of the court. And so they settled down there. With her dowry in hand, they did not want for the pleasures and necessities of life, and would often go walking out for long walks in the woods, enjoying the beauty of nature and each other's company. And the year passed, and there was no great event which occurred. But then on one of these long walks, there came the day where Kavi suddenly stopped when he leaned up against a tree and looked very pale. And Savitri rushed to his side and said, what is the matter? And he said, "I really don't know. And I have this strange feeling in my chest, and I suddenly feel very weak and out of breath. I think I will sit down and rest for a while. And perhaps when I'm rested, we can continue our journey." And so he sat down with his back against the tree, and he closed his eyes, and his breath became shallow, and then it stopped, and his heart ceased beating, and it was quite obvious that the man was dead. And when Savitri saw this, she fell to her knees and began to weep. And as she did so, there was a shadow cast over them. And when she looked up, there before her stood Jama, the gatherer of souls. A skeletal figure, dressed all in black, who held in one hand the basket, and the other hand a great staff of carved ebony, which was topped with a golden hook. Without a sound, he swept down with the staff, and the golden hook appeared to pass through Kavi's body, leaving no trace behind it. But when he raised it up, there on the end of the hook was the gossamer essence that was no doubt Kavi's soul. And with a practiced move, he flipped the soul into his basket, and he turned to walk away. And now Savitri looked up and says, "Wait, do not depart so quickly. We must discuss this." And Jama said, without bothering to even slow down or look around, "There is nothing to discuss. This man is dead. You must now look to living your own life." So now Kavi jumped up and began to follow him, saying, "Truly, we must discuss this. He was such a young man. There must have been some sort of mistake." "I do not make mistakes," said Jama. "Even without war, young men sometimes die. It is the way of things. Now go away and leave me alone. I have other duties to perform this day." Well, Savitri, remember that stubborn thing? Rather than ceasing her efforts, in fact, continued to follow him, and at one point forced her way past him to stand directly in his path, forcing him to stop, saying, "I insist that we discuss this matter. Perhaps there is a bargain to be made, perhaps some sort of trade." "I do not make bargains," said Jama. "And as far as trade, you have nothing that I want. Now stand aside that I may continue on my duties." Well, for a long moment, they stood there staring at each other, and finally Savitri lowered her gaze to the ground, saying meekly, "I suppose you were right. Very well, go on about your tasks." And she stepped to one side. But as Jama passed, she suddenly leapt forth, grabbed the staff out of his hand, and ran down the path with it. "Give that back!" cried Jama, and began to chase after her. But Savitri was light and fast and managed to keep always just a little beyond his grasp. The chase did not last for very long, and now they stood several paces apart upon the pathway, staring at each other. "So," says Savitri, "now it appears I do have something you want. Shall we talk trade?" "What is it you want?" said Jama. And Savitri said, "I have heard it said that you have the power to grant wishes. Is this so?" And Jama nodded and says, "Yes, within certain limitations, I have this power." "Very well. Return to me my staff, and I shall grant you one wish of anything within my power to grant. However, before you speak, I give you this warning. The one wish you may not make is that I return a soul once it has been taken. That wish I am forbidden to grant." So Savitri looks thoughtful, and as she did so, she held the staff out and ran her fingers along the intricate carving and says, I understand this, but for such a unique and unusual item, I think this should be worth 4 or 5 wishes at least." 4 or 5 wishes, said Jama. "That is out of the question. The most I can offer you is 2. Well, in the ancient tradition of the marketplace, they discussed this for a time and settled upon, as I'm sure you've already guessed, 3. Otherwise, this would not be called the 3 wishes of Savitri. "Very well," said Jama. "What is your first wish?" And Savitri looked thoughtful and finally said, "Well, with my husband now dead, the task of caring for his father now falls upon me. I have learned that caring for a blind man can be a very difficult task. It would be so much easier if this man could see. Therefore, my first wish is that his vision be restored to him." And Jama nodded and said, "A simple thing." And he waved his hand in the air and said, "There, it is done. Now, what is your second wish?" And Savitri again looks thoughtful and finally said, "Thinking on this, now that his sight has been restored, I see no reason he could not once again be king of his own kingdom. Therefore, for my second wish, I wish that his kingdom be restored to him as it was before. At once, if you please." And now Jama looked a bit thoughtful, and at last he looked up and said, "A somewhat more difficult thing, but yes, this is within my powers to achieve." And he waved his hand and again said, "There, it is done." And now he looked up at her and said, "Savitri, it is most honorable of you that you would consider the well-being of another before that of your own. But tell me, is there nothing that you would wish for yourself?" And Savitri thought for a moment and said, "Well, there is but one thing I would wish for myself. And that is, I would wish that I live long enough to see my children grow up to have long and happy lives, and to have children of their own who would likewise grow up to have happy lives." And Jama nodded and said, "A most appropriate wish." And he waved his hand in the air, and he said, "It is done. Now, I have completed my end of the bargain. I assume that you will complete yours." "Of course," said Savitri. And she stepped forth and handed him back his staff. And as she did so, she also said, "And by the way, I must thank you for making me immortal." And Jama said, "What? I've done no such thing." "Ah, but you have," she said. "For you see, I as of yet have borne no children, nor am I with child now. And certainly you know that by Hindu law, a woman whose husband has died is forbidden to remarry. I could, of course, choose to have children out of wedlock, but such children would be scorned and spit upon by all those about them. They could never have happy lives. And if by some miracle they found someone to take them in wedlock, their children likewise could never live in happiness. And so, by our agreement, since it is now impossible for me to ever have children or grandchildren who would have long and happy lives as we agreed, I guess that means I will live forever." Now, Jama considered this for a moment, and he realized at once how he had been tricked. And he also realized something else. For Jama, the gatherer of souls, was himself but a servant of the great god Shiva, often called the Destroyer, one of the three great gods who rules over the lands of the Hindi, these being Brahma, the creator of all things, Vishnu, the preserver, and Shiva, whose task it is to bring to an end all things on earth, whose time has reached its end. Now, Shiva the Destroyer is known for many things, but a sense of humor is not one of them. And Jama realized that when Shiva found out that he had granted immortality to a mere mortal, and a woman no less, he would be most displeased. And the result of Shiva's displeasure was invariably unpleasant. And thinking on this, Jama realized there is one option open to him. And so, without a word, he turned about on the path, returning the way they had come, with Savitri following after. And when they reached the clearing where Kavi's body lay beneath the tree, he reached into his basket and he drew out Kavi's soul and laid it back into his body. And as he did so, Kavi's heart began to beat once again, and breath returned to his body. And as his breathing grew ever stronger, Jama looked up at Savitri and said in a dark voice, "Savitri, you are indeed a clever young woman, and it is now my wish that we shall not meet again for a very, very long time." And with that, he turned about, walked into the woods, and disappeared. No sooner had this occurred that Kavi opened his eyes, and he looks up at Savitri and says, "I have just had the most peculiar dream. Could you please tell me what has happened?" And now once again Savitri fell to her knees, this time to hold him in tight embrace, saying, "I will tell you in good time all which has transpired, but right now we have to go back to our home and pack our things, for we have a journey to take tomorrow." "Oh," said Kavi as he got up and dusted himself off, "very well. By the way, where are we going?" So as they walked back to the house, Savitri explained to him everything which had transpired. And that morning, with their worldly goods carefully packed away, they set out on a journey to the east and traveled for several days until at last they passed over the border into the neighboring kingdom, where Kavi's father once again ruled as king. Here, Kavi was once again a true prince, and Savitri his princess, someday to become queen, when Kavi ascended to the throne after his father. In time, this did come to pass. And also in time, The two of them together indeed had many children who grew up to be married and had children of their own, and they all together indeed lived long and happy lives. And that is the tale of the three wishes of Savitri.